My sister ditched her kids for 8 weeks, then had me attacked when I threatened the cops. Hello, read it. Unlike real gold, kids raised as golden children are never as pure as their parents imagine them to be. Growing up, my sister always got her way. No matter how nasty or irrational she acted toward me, she always got away with it. She was the golden child, the miracle my parents cherished above everything else. It didn't hurt that she was stunningly beautiful, with thick curly hair and light eyes. My mom spent years comparing our appearances. I have dark eyes and straight hair, and I was never as pretty as my sister. Those comparisons started when we were young and only got worse as we became teenagers. My mom would constantly tell me to dress like my sister or ask her to teach me how to do makeup. But whenever I asked my sister for help, she'd bully me or mock me instead. It created a deep resentment between us. I think my sister latched onto the worst traits we saw in my mom, while I rejected them entirely. My sister's lifelong pedestal, built on nothing more than her beauty, turned her into a self-absorbed person who didn't care about anyone but herself. She thought her looks were enough to get her out of anything, and most of the time, they were. The way my mom compared us and put me down left me with serious self-esteem issues. Even now, as an adult, I'm quiet and reserved. People describe me as a pushover, and they aren't wrong. I've been working on that in therapy, trying to build the confidence to stand up for myself. It's hard. My family's treatment of me left deep scars, and it's hard to maintain healthy friendships or relationships. Trust is difficult for me. Even in high school, my sister slept with my boyfriend during senior year. She didn't even like him and said he was ugly, but she did it anyway. When my parents found out, they told me to let it go. My sister faced no consequences, and it was clear just how much they preferred her over me. That incident solidified the idea that no one would ever stand up for me. My dad had spent my whole life passively watching my mom pick at me emotionally, and I felt like no man would ever value me. It's still hard for me to connect when dating. But despite all of this, there was one silver lining. Being the ugly sister meant I had no social life, so I poured myself into studying. I graduated high school with a 4.0 GPA and got a full-ride scholarship to my first-choice university. The day I found out about the scholarship was one of the happiest days of my life, at least at first. I rushed home, excited to share the news with my family. I thought maybe, for once, I'd have something that made me feel worthy, something my sister didn't have. My sister had spent high school partying and barely scraping by academically. My parents were paying for her to go to college, even though her grades were terrible. Meanwhile, my mom had told me years earlier that I'd need to go to community college and pay my own way. When I told my parents about my scholarship, I was so excited, but their reactions crushed me. My dad gave a lukewarm "good job," and my mom didn't even look up from her phone. She ignored me completely, and for the next week, she barely acknowledged my existence. I tried to understand why she was upset. Why would my own mom be mad at me for earning something so significant? But no matter how hard I tried, she avoided me. It felt like she hated me for it, like she resented me for achieving something most parents would be proud of. That day, the happiest moment of my life turned into one of the worst. I cried myself to sleep that night, realizing how alone I really was. I wondered why my mom even had me if she was just going to spend a lifetime tearing me down. That night, I poured all my frustration into my journal and made a decision. I was done being the sad, invisible daughter. I was going to channel all my anger into building a better life for myself. If I couldn't count on my family to support me, I'd make sure I didn't need them. I would be stable, independent, and successful, even if I never found love. So that's exactly what I did. I graduated from college with honors, landed a great position at the company I'd interned for, and started earning six figures by the time I turned 23. Every holiday, I'd visit my family and share how I was doing, but my parents never went out of their way to congratulate me. Extended family would give me kind words, but my mom always acted like my accomplishments didn't matter, or worse, like they annoyed her. I learned not to tell her about my promotions or how much I was earning because it only seemed to make her resent me more. My dad, at least, once told me he was happy for me. It was the nicest thing either of them had ever said to me. Even as an adult, my mom continued to make me feel unwelcome. At one Christmas dinner, my uncle congratulated me on a promotion I had just earned and asked about the house I was planning to buy. I felt proud, but before I could answer, my mom cut him off and dismissed the conversation, muttering under her breath that it was probably untrue anyway. Later that year, I bought my house and shared the news on social media. Everyone in my family liked the post, except for my mom. I think my success upset her even more because my sister's life had taken a very different path. She had gone to college on my parents' dime, but she ended up failing out and getting pregnant by her first college boyfriend. They were incompatible, but instead of fixing their problems, they had another child. I tried not to cry when I saw her announcement about the second baby, knowing those kids were likely growing up in a toxic environment. Since my sister and her children's father were both terrible people, it wasn't surprising that my relationship with them never improved. I met her boyfriend a few times during the holidays, but he couldn't even bother to remember my name or hold a conversation. Every year, he would leave with trays of food without contributing anything to the meal. As for my sister, we didn't talk much after we moved out of our parents' house. We followed each other on social media, but our interactions during family holidays were limited to her making nasty remarks about my weight or how I dressed. I think she was projecting because I wore designer clothes and cycled through high-end purses, which irritated her. She would constantly insinuate that my bags were fake, finding every opportunity to insult me. One Thanksgiving, she looked me up and down the moment I arrived and hurled a cruel remark about my outfit, branding me as stuck-up. Her hostility was unprovoked and relentless, even in front of her kids. She'd curse at me openly, setting a poor example for her young children. I couldn't help but think she was pure trash, and I didn't feel bad about what happened later. One weekend morning, after a grueling work week, I was relaxing at home when my doorbell rang. To my shock, I found my sister's two kids, aged 10 and 7, standing on my porch with overnight bags. Confused, I asked them why they were there, and they told me their mom had gone on vacation for 8 weeks and left them with me. I hadn't spoken to my sister since our family's 4th of July barbecue, where she had made a humiliating comment about my weight. I had no idea why she thought I'd babysit her kids for 2 months without warning. The boys were good, quiet kids, and they seemed just as confused as I was. I let them in while I tried to get a hold of my sister. She ignored my calls at first, but I kept dialing until she finally picked up. The conversation escalated quickly when I told her I wouldn't be watching her kids and insisted she return to pick them up. She responded by threatening me. She said she'd contact my workplace and make false claims about my mental health, implying I wasn't taking my medication, to get me fired. My career meant everything to me, and I couldn't afford that risk. I hung up, overwhelmed and trying to figure out my next steps. The timing couldn't have been worse. I had a trip planned to Australia in a month to visit my long-distance boyfriend, Eric, and meet his family for the first time. It was an important milestone in our relationship, and I'd been looking forward to it all year. Now, my life was thrown into chaos because of my sister, and I had no idea what to do. Desperate, I called my mom, but I shouldn't have been surprised when she sided with my sister, just like she always did. I explained the situation, hoping my mom would understand how unreasonable my sister had been, but instead, she guilted me. She claimed my sister had done so much for me and that I needed to support her, just this once. That sent me over the edge. I exploded, demanding she name a single time my sister had helped me or improved my life in any way. I told her that both she and my sister had treated me like an outsider my entire life, making me feel less like family and more like an inconvenience. Eventually, I demanded my mom come to my house. If worst came to worst, I figured I could leave her in charge of my nephews while I went to Australia. When she arrived, she was as cold as ever, looking at me with the same disdain I'd known all my life. She launched into a lecture about family obligations and how I was being an awful sibling. I ignored her self-righteous sermon and pressed her for details about my sister's so-called vacation. None of it made sense. Why would she leave her kids behind for 8 weeks without any plan? That's when my mom's demeanor shifted, and she admitted the truth. My sister wasn't on a vacation. She was being flown out by her sugar daddy. At first, I thought my mom was joking, but her expression told me otherwise. The absurdity of it all hit me like a tidal wave. My sister had abandoned her kids to chase a man who was bankrolling her life, and my mom was defending her. Exhausted and furious, I told my mom exactly what I thought about the way she had raised my sister, a selfish, irresponsible person who had no problem leaving her children behind. My mom, unsurprisingly, defended my sister as she always had. When I expressed my frustration about her abandoning her kids for sugar daddy instead of finding a job to support them, my mom turned my words back on me. At one point, she even said something so cruel it shook me to my core, that no matter how much money I had or how nice my house was, I'd always be the ugly duckling compared to my sister, destined to live and die ugly. Hearing that made me want to lose control. I had to physically restrain myself from throwing her out of my house right then and there. When I screamed at her to leave, she yelled back that she wasn't going anywhere. As I tried to guide her toward the door, she shoved me with all her strength into a coffee table. On the table sat one of my favorite vases, a gift from my boyfriend during his last visit. It shattered into countless pieces when I fell into it. Seeing the broken vase on the floor mirrored how I felt inside, completely destroyed. That moment broke me. I had a full-on meltdown, screaming and crying for her to leave, or I'd call the police. I felt awful knowing my nephews could hear everything from the other room, but I couldn't hold it together anymore. After finally forcing my mom out of the house, I found my nephews cautiously peeking out from where they'd been hiding. Their wide, nervous eyes broke my heart. They didn't deserve to witness this chaos, no matter how much I resented their mother. I ordered food for us and let them watch movies and play video games in the living room until they fell asleep. Later, I managed to reach my sister again, and the conversation went nowhere good. She continued to threaten me, repeating that I had no choice but to watch her kids or risk losing my job. She took a cruel pleasure in reminding me that my career was all I had, and without it, I'd go back to being a nobody. Her words hit me hard because they were rooted in the truth. I tied so much of my identity and self-worth to my career. I was crying as I begged her to explain why she hated me so much and how she could abandon her children for a sugar daddy. She didn't care. She bragged about how much money she could make in a few months and used it to belittle me even more. Eventually, she hung up on me, leaving me feeling completely powerless. Upstairs, alone and overwhelmed, I called my boyfriend. It was the first chance I'd had to speak to him since this nightmare began. I broke down and vented about everything, my sister's threats, my mom's disrespect, and how trapped I felt. Even though he was on the other side of the world, he made me feel supported in a way no one else had. He reminded me that my sister's actions were potentially criminal and urged me to get evidence of her threats, especially the one about making false claims to my employer. He suggested I record our next conversation just in case. His advice made me realize just how dangerous my sister could be, and I knew he was right. As terrifying as it was, I needed to be prepared. Despite my exhaustion, I still wanted my nephews to feel comfortable and cared for. I knew what it was like to grow up in a home where you felt unwanted, and I never wanted to make them feel that way. I went downstairs and joined them for a video game. To my surprise, we ended up having a great time. They were so excited when they realized I knew how to play first-person shooters, and their laughter as they watched me win game after game was infectious. By the time we ordered pizza and had a playful contest to see who could eat the most pepperoni, I realized I was starting to love these little boys. They were nothing like their mother. Despite everything, they were polite, sweet, and funny. As the day went on, I noticed small things that broke my heart. The older nephew's clothes were too small, and their socks were full of holes. When I checked the rest of the clothes their mom had packed, it was more of the same. Old, ill-fitting, and insufficient. I wasn't surprised by her neglect, but I couldn't let it slide. I decided to take them to the mall to buy some proper clothes. The trip to the mall turned into something unexpectedly emotional. My nephews, who had been shy and quiet at first, came alive with excitement. They ran from store to store, thrilled at the idea of picking out their own clothes. I couldn't say no to anything. Every time my youngest nephew gave me his goofy smile, showing the gap where his front teeth were missing, my heart melted. It reminded me of how it felt to be a neglected child, and I was determined to give them the kind of love and attention I'd always wanted. That day, watching them beam with joy as they carried their shopping bags, I realized how much they had been missing and how much they needed someone who truly cared about them. I couldn't resist spoiling my nephews a little that day. By the time we left the mall, they both had new clothes that fit them properly and made them look and feel great. I had also bought them each a Nintendo Switch. When I handed them the consoles, they both broke down crying and hugged me tightly. It was a bittersweet moment, seeing their joy, but also realizing how much they had lacked. On the ride home, my older nephew started crying again. When I asked if he was okay, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and asked why I was being so nice to them and what they had done to deserve it. His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I told him they deserved my kindness because they were my family, and as kids, they deserved to be happy. This only made him cry harder. He admitted that he was angry at his mom for keeping us apart. Hearing that broke my heart even more. I told him how sorry I was that we hadn't had the chance to know each other sooner, but I was so glad they were here with me now, even if it hadn't been planned. The more I talked to them, the more they opened up about their lives at home. It was exactly what I had feared. They described moments of neglect and mistreatment that made my heart ache. Hearing the pain in their voices was almost too much to bear. I had always known my sister and her children's father were terrible people, but hearing the details from these sweet boys was gut-wrenching. When we got home, I made a big dinner and they spent the evening happily playing on their new Switches. I left them in the living room and went to my room to make another call to my sister, determined to follow my boyfriend's plan. This time, I kept my emotions in check, though it wasn't easy. I wanted to scream at her for everything she'd done, but I stayed calm and carefully guided the conversation toward the threats she'd made earlier. Predictably, she brought up the same accusations, claiming she'd contact my employer with false medical allegations if I didn't comply. She doubled down, saying no one would believe me because of my supposed issues. Her words were venomous, but I held my composure. I recorded the entire conversation as she ranted, repeating that I didn't deserve my job or anything good in life. She sounded erratic, possibly even under the influence of something, but I stayed focused. Once I had what I needed, I ended the call, ignoring the hateful words she continued to throw at me. I felt a wave of relief knowing I now had proof of her blackmail. My boyfriend had been absolutely right. It was the evidence I needed to protect myself. After the call, I tried to decompress by spending time with my nephews. I made sure they felt safe and comfortable, putting them to bed later that night. The next morning, I woke early and called Child Protective Services as soon as the lines opened. I explained everything, how my sister had abandoned her kids and left them with me under false pretenses, using manipulation and blackmail to force me into compliance. I provided the recording as evidence, and the agent I spoke to assured me it would be a critical part of their investigation. They confirmed my sister's actions were criminal and that they'd be contacting her immediately. The call left me shaken but also relieved to have taken action. I spent the rest of the day focusing on my nephews, trying to keep things as normal and positive as possible. The next day, my mom called me, and against my better judgment, I answered. She was furious. The moment I mentioned I had called CPS, she hung up. I was certain she went straight to my sister to warn her. That night, I barely slept, dreading what might come next. Sure enough, the following morning at work, my receptionist informed me that my supervisor had scheduled an urgent meeting with me. I knew this was it. My sister had followed through with her threats. When I walked into the meeting room, I was greeted by my two supervisors and a higher-up I'd never met. Their expressions were cautious, almost suspicious, and I felt like I was under a microscope. As expected, they informed me that a family member had contacted them, claiming I was unmedicated and suffering from severe mental health issues. They mentioned specific, fabricated episodes that my sister had described in detail. Their concern was palpable, and I could tell they were taking the allegations seriously. But I had been prepared for this moment. I calmly opened my briefcase and handed each of them a packet of documentation. It included a letter from my doctor, records proving my strict adherence to my medication regimen over the past 5 years, and additional verification from my therapist and psychiatrist. I explained the situation with my family, outlining my sister's manipulative behavior and history of mental health struggles, and assured them the claims were entirely unfounded. The room was silent as they reviewed the documents. Eventually, their expressions softened. They apologized for the inconvenience, explaining that they had to do their due diligence before closing the matter. One of my supervisors even took the opportunity to praise my recent performance and highlight my contributions to the company, which felt like a vindication after all the stress I'd been through. I left the meeting feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. My sister's attempt to sabotage me had failed, and I felt a renewed sense of determination to protect myself and my nephews from her toxicity. I left the meeting feeling victorious. My sister's ridiculous plan had completely backfired, and I couldn't stop giggling at how miserably she had failed. All day at work, I found myself smiling, thinking about how I would call her and let her know just how well her scheme had gone. As soon as I got to my car, I made the call. Laughing, I told her that the meeting had lasted only 15 minutes because her accusations were so absurd that my bosses hadn't believed a word of it. Her response was pure rage. She accused me of lying, insisting I must have been fired, and was just too ashamed to admit it. Her fury only made me laugh harder. I told her she had failed, just as she had failed at everything else in her life, and reminded her that even her kids seemed disappointed in her. She lashed out, hurling insults and threats, and vowed to come back immediately to make me regret everything. Although I was still laughing after the call, the weight of her words hit me later. The thought of her returning, unhinged and angry, sent a chill down my spine. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about my nephews. Over the past few days, I had grown so close to them, and the idea of handing them back to my sister was unbearable. She was perpetuating the same neglect and cruelty our mother had inflicted on me, and I hated her more than ever. Checking on my sleeping nephews, I felt my heart break. They looked so peaceful and innocent, unaware of the storm surrounding them. I stood in the hallway and cried quietly, overwhelmed by the fear of losing them and the guilt of not being able to protect them. The next morning, everything unraveled. I woke to loud, aggressive banging on my front door. When I opened it, there was my sister, my mom, and an enormous man I didn't recognize. He had to be at least 6 feet 5 inches and close to 300 pounds. Before I could say anything, the man shoved me hard, sending me to the ground. My shoulder throbbed as I tried to get up, but my sister and her entourage had already barged inside. Chaos erupted. My nephews, woken by the noise, came out of their room looking confused and scared. I tried to shield them, but my sister barked at the man to take them to the car. The boys resisted, pleading to stay with me, but the man picked them up as though they weighed nothing. I tried to pull my older nephew from his grasp, but he grabbed my head and slammed it into the wall. Dazed, I sank to the floor, helpless as he carried them out of the house. My mom stood by, crying but saying nothing. She followed them out, leaving me behind on the floor. My sister, the last to leave, walked over to me and spat in my face. It was the most degrading and disgusting thing anyone had ever done to me. As I sat there, stunned and heartbroken, they drove off in a black SUV I didn't recognize. My nephews left without their belongings, no clothes, no switches, not even breakfast. I couldn't stop thinking about how scared and vulnerable they must have been in that moment. After they left, I had a full-blown anxiety attack. I couldn't believe what had just happened or how powerless I'd been to stop it. The thought of those boys being dragged back into my sister's chaotic life broke me. Once I calmed down, I knew I had to act quickly. I called the police immediately and explained everything that had happened. Thankfully, they were already aware of the CPS investigation and took my report seriously. I described the assault, the abduction, and the stranger who had helped my sister. My voice trembled, but I forced myself to stay focused and provide all the details. After the chaos that morning, I tried to focus my mind, but it was impossible. I kept replaying every detail of what had happened. Thankfully, my job had trained me to notice small things, and I managed to remember the Suburban's license plate perfectly, along with descriptions of the stranger, my mom, and my sister. The police were thorough when I gave them the information, but my nerves were frayed. My sister had looked completely feral when she showed up at my house, her eyes wild. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been using drugs during her trip abroad, which only added to my fears for my nephews. I spent the rest of the day restless, unable to eat or sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my nephews' terrified faces. My thoughts spiraled about my mom's endless excuses for my sister, about the choices that had turned her into the person she'd become, and about the trip she had taken. I wondered what her so-called sugar daddy had paid her, and if it had been worth abandoning her children. The more I thought, the more I began to imagine a life where it was just me and my nephews. I had the space for them, and now I had room in my heart too. I wanted to fight for them, to give them the life my sister never could. In a custody battle, the contrast would be glaring. My degrees, stable job, and home against her reckless, chaotic life. My anxious thoughts were interrupted hours later when the police called back. They had found the Suburban and pulled it over. The officer on the line explained that they had sent 3 squad cars because they knew the man had been violent. Sure enough, the situation escalated. The man tried to attack an officer and was shot in the thigh after punching 2 cops and giving a female officer a black eye. My sister also physically fought back, lashing out at the officer who tried to handcuff her. Hearing this felt surreal. I picture my sister and the hulking stranger battling police on the side of the highway. It sounded like something out of a trashy reality show, not my life. I was still trying to process everything when the officer told me my sister wanted to use her one phone call on me. I was stunned. He admitted she was likely going to ask for bail money. I told him I wouldn't be taking the call. She could rot in jail for all I cared. The officer chuckled, understanding my frustration, and we ended the call. Although my sister was now behind bars, I felt little relief. My nephews were placed in CPS custody, and while I was glad they were safe, I was also heartbroken and anxious. I wanted to speak to them, but when I called CPS, I was met with resistance. They wouldn't let me talk to the boys, even though I explained I was one of the few stable family members they had. I was shuffled to a different department, where I was stonewalled again. On top of everything, my long-anticipated trip to Australia was only a week away. Canceling would mean losing thousands of dollars in bookings, and it would leave a terrible impression on my boyfriend's family. Meeting them was incredibly important to me, especially since I planned on marrying him one day. The last thing I wanted was to jeopardize our future by seeming unreliable or disrespectful. Despite everything swirling around me, my nephews were still at the forefront of my mind. I was determined to find a way to bring them back into my life and out of the chaos my sister had created. By the time my trip to Australia arrived, I was emotionally drained and running on empty. I spent the week before my flight trying to prepare, but I couldn't stop bursting into tears every time I thought about my nephews. I had no idea where they were or how they were doing, and the thought haunted me. I felt terrible because my boyfriend and I had been so excited for this trip for months, yet here I was, distracted and consumed by anxiety. He was as kind and supportive as ever, but our conversations inevitably revolved around my stress and worry. I was furious at my sister for the chaos she had caused. Her selfish decision to visit her sugar daddy had left my life in shambles, and the betrayal of her trying to get me fired still stung deeply. Even my dad, who surely knew about the situation, had done nothing to step in. His silence and inaction reminded me of how spineless he had always been. My mom, as usual, was no better. She had enabled my sister's reckless behavior, which had ultimately led to her grandchildren being placed in the care of strangers. It was hard not to feel completely abandoned by my family. On the day of my flight, I sat at the airport bar, 2 cocktails in, scrolling through photos of my nephews. I came across some silly photo booth pictures we had taken at the mall, and the tears started again. I missed them so much it physically hurt. But I resolved that moment to make the most of my time in Australia. I needed to focus on my own life and happiness, at least for a little while. The trip turned out to be exactly what I needed. When my boyfriend greeted me at the airport, Picking me up and spinning me around, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. After everything I had been through, being in his arms was healing. He spent the entire trip catering to me, showering me with warmth and love. Meeting his family went better than I could have hoped. His parents were fun, active, and welcoming. They took me on hikes and showed me breathtaking views, sharing their favorite spots. One day, my boyfriend took me to a secret waterfall. It was just the two of us, swimming, laughing, and kissing under the water. It was one of the most romantic days of my life, and I couldn't believe how perfectly the trip had gone despite all my worries beforehand. But when I returned home, the nightmare with my sister resumed. A few days after landing, I went to the local police station to press charges against both her and my mom for breaking into my home. I wasn't going to let them get away with having that man physically shove me aside so they could storm into my house. At the station, I learned that the CPS investigation into my sister was still ongoing, which frustrated me to no end. It baffled me that nothing conclusive had been found yet. If they just talked to my nephews, they'd know the truth about what those boys had endured. I was also infuriated that my sister's arrest alongside a man who had assaulted multiple police officers wasn't enough to prove she was unfit to parent. How much more evidence did they need? I left the police station feeling a mix of satisfaction that the charges were filed but deep frustration over the unresolved investigation. My nephews were still on my mind constantly. I knew being with strangers was better than being with my sister, but I hated that they were without me. I couldn't stop thinking about how my sister had dragged them out of my house that morning without letting them take anything. My youngest nephew had a little dog plushie he carried everywhere. The thought of him without it broke my heart all over again. Ever since my sister had taken my nephews, I had been keeping my youngest nephew's little plush dog with me. Waking up to see it every morning was bittersweet. It brought comfort but also made me cry, thinking about how scared and abandoned the boys must have felt. My sister hadn't even let them put on shoes that day, and I couldn't stop imagining how lost and disoriented they must have been. I wanted so badly to make things right, but until CPS reached a decision, my hands were tied. Finally, about a month after my sister's arrest, after weeks of calling CPS daily for updates, I got the news. CPS had officially removed custody of my nephews from my sister. They explained that she would now have to go to court if she ever wanted custody back. Frustrated, I asked how that was different from what had already been happening, and they clarified that this was a formal, legal step toward permanently removing her rights as a parent. The agent mentioned that if a more suitable relative came forward to petition for custody, the court would consider them. I knew instantly what I had to do. Without hesitation, I opened a separate court case to fight for full custody of my nephews. I didn't care about the cost or how long it would take. I was determined to win. I hired the best lawyer I could afford and threw myself into the battle. But before the custody case even began, the charges I had filed against my sister for breaking into my home went to trial first. I knew some people might judge me for taking my sister to court, but I didn't care. At that point, I would have fought her in a parking lot if it meant protecting my nephews. This was about doing things the right way to secure my future with them. The first day of the trial was surreal. It was the first time I had seen my sister since the day she had broken into my house, and the last interaction we'd had was her spitting in my face. Neither of us was happy to see the other. As the trial progressed, the judge mentioned the custody case I had filed against her. To my shock, it became clear that my sister hadn't known about it until that moment. Her public defender hadn't informed her, and the news hit her like a brick. True to form, my sister snapped. Right there in the courtroom, she turned to me, screamed my name, and lunged at me like a wild animal. She clawed at my face, ripping at my hair, and before the bailiff could pull her off, she sank her teeth into my forearm. The pain was excruciating, and the bite became infected later. All of this happened in front of the judge, sealing her fate. Over the next 2 years, the criminal charges against her piled up. By the time the trials concluded, she was handed a life sentence. With her extensive list of crimes, her chances of appeal were virtually non-existent. My mom, who had also been charged for her role in the break-in, avoided prison only by testifying against my sister. Watching her throw my sister under the bus, sobbing crocodile tears, was strangely satisfying. After a lifetime of enabling my sister, she had finally turned on her golden child. That day, I decided I never wanted to see either of them again. I had endured enough of their toxicity for one lifetime. The custody battle for my nephews was long and grueling. Their birth father and his family entered the fight, dragging the case out even further. But I didn't care. There wasn't a force on earth that could keep me from those boys now. After nearly 2 years of legal battles, I finally won full custody. The day I brought my nephews home was one I will never forget. Their smiles lit up the room as they explored the bedrooms I had decorated for them. My youngest nephew ran to me, clutching his rediscovered Switch, and I surprised him by pulling out his plush dog. He leapt into my arms, hugging me tightly as tears streamed down his face. My oldest nephew joined us, and we all hugged together, crying and laughing. Through his tears, my oldest nephew looked up at me, his big eyes filled with gratitude. Smiling, he said softly, "I knew it, Auntie. I just knew you would come back for us one day."